Welcome back, everyone, to the Sound of Safety presented by Sensear. This is our fourth podcast in a series of six. And joining us today, and welcome back to Dr. Darrow, who is an expert that's going to be joining us in a six-part series on occupational hearing loss and hazards in the workplace. So thank you again, Dr. Darrow, for joining us.
No, thank you for having me here. I think that these are very powerful conversations. I think that if we can get enough people to hear us, no pun intended, that we can really start to make some change and move that mountain when it comes to occupational noise exposure.
No, I totally agree. And throughout these podcasts, we've mentioned the fact that, the OSHA regulations are that prolonged exposure above 85 decibels can cause permanent hearing loss. And I think that's something that everybody's pretty aware of. But I want to take a step back because I think we've kind of skimmed over the surface and maybe generalized noise when we talk about levels and things like that. But most people, I don't think, our laymen don't truly understand the four different types of noise and the different noises that are out there and how these different noises can impact your hearing in different ways in both short term and long term. So can you just describe and give us a lesson here about the different types of noise that are in our environment and are some more detrimental to us than others from a short term and long term impact?
Well, let me start with the more detrimental or less detrimental. The problem with noise is it always boils down to the volume and the length of exposure. So that's that. I don't know that anybody can ever resolve that issue. But ultimately, yeah, there's like, broadly speaking, there's two categories of noise, right? There's impact noise, a really loud short burst, and then there's continuous noise. But if you dive a little bit deeper, right, there's impulse, there's intermittent, continuous, and then there's low frequency noise, right? And so those are really the classifications. And so you may not in general work in a noisy environment. Like as soon as you say noisy environment, everybody thinks about a factory with a loud machine running. But you might work in an environment where you're regularly exposed to impulse noise, right? I'm talking about sudden, sharp sounds, right? Like just this rapid change in pressure that could have many effects on hearing. Not only can it, damage the cells in the ear, but it has the potential to rip open your eardrum, right? If you'll allow me to tell this story, right? If we all remember the Boston bombing, right? Which was a terrible event during the Boston Marathon. The most common injury on that day was ruptured eardrums from people that were upwards of a quarter mile away from the explosion, because loud, sudden impulse noise can really have a detrimental physical effect on the ears.
So, I mean, when employers are looking at this, and when we look at our workplace, how do we assess these different types of noise? I mean, is there a way to, beyond just taking our, devices around and measuring what the actual, the level is at a given time or things like that? Is there a method or a way that it can be more comprehensive as we look at occupational noise?
Well, yeah, right. Because part of the problem with occupational noise is they want to stick a device on you that measures sound over an 8-hour window. And so if you're exposed to a couple of loud bursts of sound, this impulse noise, it averages out to like not a big deal. And then as far as OSHA is concerned, and as far as your compliance officer is concerned, it's not that big of a deal, not something that you even need to address, when in reality, the science tells us that safe sounds are below 70 dB. And the way I think about it is if you're exposed to noises over 70 dB, whether it be impulse, whether it be intermittent, whether it be, continuous, that has the potential to have a long-term effect on the ear. And guess what? Noise exposure, continuous noise exposure, also has a detrimental effect on mental health. And just being in that environment, the amount of stress and anxiety, like our bodies are not designed to deal with that level of sensory exposure for that long of a period of time. Even if you're, as far as OSHA is concerned, even if you're in the safe range, right? Just sitting around listening to 80 dB noise, which OSHA doesn't care much about, is really annoying. And that annoyance is stressful and it raises your cortisol levels. And it can have a profound impact on the patient, on the person. Sorry.
Yeah, and, and with that knowledge, I think you see so many times a knee-jerk reaction to just go noise canceling devices. Let's just get something that takes everything out and that'll be better. But we know that, having awareness of our surroundings and the safety implications of that. But I want to take it one step further because I've seen some studies out there and some notes around not only the impact of situational awareness of just hearing it, but how you react and your decision making. Can you talk a little bit of just how the brain kind of processes situational awareness and your decision making response, I guess, to that?
Look, I think that um when you're dealing with situational awareness, you're talking about your body's response to everything that's happening around it, right? And that can really be extremely stressful on the body and on the mind, right? So it goes beyond just hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And being exposed to that all the time, having this heightened sense of everything that's happening around me. Again, that's not the way that our bodies were built. It's not the way that we were designed. And it can have this long-term impact on our mental health, which if you're the employer, you should care about because mental health costs continue to rise on a regular basis.
I think when we talk about situational awareness, again, it's just, I think we oversimplify it sometimes, but just, oh, yeah, you can hear that truck. But the spike, what's actually going on in your brain and how you react and the stimulus of that and the decision making aspect adds another layer to it. And so I really want to help users understand kind of that whole cognitive recognition or awareness and reaction aspect of it as well, because it's not only just hearing it, it's how do we respond to it as well.
Well, yeah, because there's right. I mean, once you're in these environments, right, there really is this physiological response. We're activating the sympathetic nervous system. We're increasing heart rate and blood pressure. Doing that long term is not good. You got dilation of pupils. You've got peripheral vasoconstrictions. I mean, there's so much physiologically that's happening that when you do this on a regular basis and you're exposed to it, I mean, you want to think, oh, you just adapt to it, but your body does not adapt to it long term, which can lead to then more cardiovascular issues, which increases the risk of stroke and cognitive decline and all sorts of issues, right? And
Mm,
so the importance of situational awareness when it comes to safety is, right, we're talking about preventing accidents. We're talking about preventing falls. We're talking about preventing long-term damage to the auditory system. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it.
no, absolutely. Yeah. And I still struggle with the fact as important as situational awareness is from an industry standpoint, we still seem very behind the eight ball. I've told about it before, there's no quantifiable measure, there's no regulatory standard for devices that says you need to have this. And that's why we're here. I mean, it's really try to bring that education of not just hearing prevention and hearing loss and what we do as far as processes, but it's also what else do we need to bring into this that is going to be more comprehensive in finding a solution instead of just trying to address one variable in the equation.
Yes, right. And accepting the fact that when you're in a noisy environment, and this is really we labeled the four types of noise, but for any of them, ultimately you're interfering with the person's mental well-being, you're interfering with their ability to concentrate, which will mean reduced productivity. You're reducing their ability to communicate with others, which will reduce productivity.
Mhm.
It leads to annoyance and stress, which reduces productivity. So again, it's not obvious. As you said, it's not easy to sort of wrap your hands around and measure the situational awareness. But again, accepting the fact that this is happening will then allow you to address it ahead of time rather than once the damage is done.
No, absolutely. And I think, taking us back to the different types of noise that you classified, can you maybe give us some examples of what those, so when we talk about impulse and low frequency, what are some of the common noises that fit into each one of those buckets?
So, like I said, I think I was explaining impulse. We're talking about something sharp, something quick, something that's very loud, almost like a jackhammer is more intermittent, but just something that is a quick noise in an environment. Intermittent noise, we're talking about sounds that are occurring in more irregular patterns, right? Where it's a little bit quiet, maybe it gets a little bit louder. And so again, measure things on average, which is what OSHA wants you to do, which is what compliance officers want you to do. And you may not actually be able to quantify, or you might not meet the criteria for this noise is damaging over time, right?
Mhm.
Continuous noise is just that constant, the machine is running, the engine's running, the big, the factory line is just running all day, right? I mean, these can have such long-term impacts on a patient's health. Low frequency noise. Now, here's the issue with low frequency noise is this is the type of noise that we don't necessarily even perceive, but it is having an impact on our auditory system. So it's almost like a little bit below the audible and the noticeable spectrum. They're more felt than they are heard, but they too can have long-term damaging effects, right? Lead to vibrations that can alter, your mental state, can alter your hearing, can sort of affect the bones in your ear. There's so much to it.
So, I mean, that is great points that you bring up, and especially with, going back to OSHA regulations and taking an average. What advice would you give to some of these safety professionals? Because obviously, I mean, if we're talking about impulse, that may be complete and the intermittent, those may happen very infrequently during the course. And so if you're taking an 8-hour average or a 12-hour average, whatever you're doing from an assessment standpoint, it sounds like there's a lot of risk to potentially smooth out the curve and smooth out the data with some of these more detrimental types of noise that may be in the environment.
Eh, No, you're exactly right. And so I go back to, if you are exposed to sounds over 70 dB, you are now in the range for potential noise exposure. Therefore, it is my opinion that you can't overprotect your hearing,
Mhm.
right? It's like everybody's looking for that minimum point of when they should start protecting hearing, wherein, and I believe I've talked about this before in an earlier episode, if you actually go back to the OSHA standards and where they originated from, just the 85 dB for 8 hours a day, it's already known that a significant portion of people exposed to that will experience noise induced hearing loss,
Mhm.
which means we already have to backpedal it down, right? 70 dB up to 80, 85 dB. We're talking about more than a tenfold increase in the intensity, right? I don't want to get too far off topic, but the way sound is measured is on a logarithmic scale. And when you consider 70 to 80 dB, we just think it's 10 units. It's not that big a deal.
Mhm.
No, it's 10 compressed units, and it's actually this multiplication factor of 10. So there's really a huge difference there. And the ear is very sensitive to that change. And so if we accept the science, if we accept that OSHA standards are not strict enough as it is, once you are in an environment where you have an average reading of 70, I'll bend a little bit and say 70 to 75 dB, you should be at least consider protecting your hearing, because you can't overprotect hearing.
No, no, that's great. I really appreciate you bringing that because again, I think we get so focused on just meeting the regulation versus taking a step back and realizing that a lot of those regulations are based on decades old research and being proactive and maybe putting standards and technology and processes all in place that match where the research is today versus just meeting the regulation.
Exactly, exactly. And really what's only started to emerge in the last 10 to 20 years is that lower level, so not 85, I'm talking 80 dB, 78 decibels, 75 decibels of long-term exposure, and the toxicity, the long-term neural toxicity that can happen in the ear, that can result in damage to the cells in the ear, the neural connections in the ear. This is really, it is emerging research, because what research were do excuse me, what researchers were doing in the 80s and the 90s was just cranking it up, right? They would just turn it up as loud as they could be. They wanted to understand impulse noise, continuous noise. And if you look at any of that research, it was always 95 dB, 102 decibels. It was like they really cranked it to understand the physiological effects and to understand the gross anatomy of changes in the ear. What we've learned in the last 15 to 20 years are these submicroscopic. So we're talking like you need high power, potentially electron, microscopes that allow you to see submicroscopic structural changes that we never knew about. And now we know those changes are permanent, they're lasting, and they lead to very long-term detrimental effects. And I'll wrap it up here with basically what that noise exposure is doing is it's not creating an immediate change. It's long-term cumulative damage that, as I've said before, instead of getting old age hearing loss at 80, you're getting it at 55 or 65.
Right. Yeah, and as we've talked so many times before, I mean, we're having more and more employees these days that are they're in that 55 to 60 year range, and it's going to continue. And I think right now, between what we've talked about the last time with the employer impact, and then bringing everything up to date to where the research is at as we head into a year right now as we close out 2023. I know a lot of companies are looking at the economic state in which we are in right now from a global perspective and looking for ways to be more economical. And I think you've given them some really great tips of take a step back. There's money to be saved here. There's money to be more economical, both from a short term and long term, but hearing loss has to come in to that factor, and there's ways for them to save if they do bump this up on the priority scale.
It's getting it bumped up on the priority scale. That isn't that easy, but that's what we're doing. We're doing it together.
It absolutely. Okay, on that note, I really appreciate it. I think we're going to wrap up this next podcast and head into our 5th series. But I want to thank you again today, Dr. Darrow, for joining us. I think this was a great topic. It's something that a lot of people don't talk about. So I really appreciate you being here today. And for our viewers, again, please leave your suggestions, comments. We'd love to hear from you as we're going to continue to invest and focus on this and bringing more education on to not only employers, but our employees. So we definitely welcome any kind of suggestions or share your best practices. We'd love to hear some success stories of where this has been a priority out in the industry and how you guys got that attention and how you made it work. But again, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.